wanted to build my music from the bottom up, piece by piece. And I just have a reason that I arrived at myself for every note I play.
Bill Evans was one of the world's most celebrated jazz icons, maybe best known for playing on Miles Davis's Kind of Blue at the end of the 1950s. Still the best-selling jazz album of all time. The Bill Evans Trio Sunday at the Village Vanguard is also considered one of the greatest jazz records ever made. But just days after it was recorded, in 1961, the trio's bassist died in a car crash and Evans disappeared from public life for months. My guest today has written a fictionalised account of what happened during those months in his novel Intermission. Owen Martell, welcome to the show.
Hello.
It's a pleasure to have you here. Now, Owen, you've been described as one of the most promising young writers in Britain today. Your first novel won the Welsh Book of the Year award. You've written 2 others in the Welsh language. This is your first book in English, and you're here because it's being translated into French. Now, I know Bill Evans has some Welsh roots. Tell us about this choice of character, this musician, and why this period of time in his life.
Well, it came, I think, initially out of admiration and an appreciation for the music itself. It was actually a friend of mine who introduced me to Bill Evans many years ago. I sort of initially thought, because I'd sort of understood that he had Welsh heritage, I thought, well, this is a chance to sort of reclaim one of the jazz greats for Wales, as it were. But it quickly became apparent on sort of, as I read around the subject a little bit, that that wasn't the case. And the book that I'd sort of imagined writing all those years ago morphed into something quite different. As it became apparent to me that I was less interested in sort of the obvious jazz aspects of, traditional, or what we seem to have as a sort of traditional view of the jazz life. And that sort of, that image that we have didn't seem to tally exactly with what I saw of and knew of Bill Evans. When I read a biography of Bill Evans in which, one chapter ended with the death of Scott LaFaro and then picked up 5 or 6 months later. So I thought, well, what I wanted to read about was, in those 5 months.
Where was he? Well, here in Paris, there's actually a piano school called the Bill Evans Piano Academy, and we've been speaking to one of the teachers there, Etienne Gouraud, about why Bill Evans was such a game changer for the jazz world. He's playing B minor waltz from the album You Must Believe in Spring.
Bill Evans was an inspirational figure for pianists, as he was the first to build a bridge between classical music and jazz. It was the first time someone took classical elements and applied them to jazz standards and to compositions.
So, Owen, such a legend in the jazz world. Did you feel like you were taking a risk writing about such a legend and a real person?
To a certain extent, yes. But I was very aware that he was somebody who had existed and still has family, and so there's a certain sort of sensitivity involved with that. That said, it was never my intention to. I went into it with the best intentions in some ways with regard to Bill Evans himself, because I was only curious. So compared to sort of the sort of hatchet jobs that appear about sort of people still alive today, my book is kind of really tame compared to that kind of that kind of thing.
And the novel is told from 4 different points of view. Bill's older brother Harry, his mum, his dad, and of Bill himself. It is set at this pivotal moment in American music and culture. But this book, is it more about grief than it is about music?
Yes and no, probably. I think it's about grief and music. It's about the way music and other things that we do as people are there not sort of as things apart from life and death and grief, but as actual sort of components within those events. So it was just really interesting to me, for example, to think of a phenomenal musician who has music at his, not just at his fingertips, but sort of everywhere in his existence, and this music that he would transmit to people and that other people would take on board as something that they would make a sort of cornerstone of their lives, when he would be faced with sort of the need for music to do the same in his life after a sort of a devastating loss, whether or not that's sort of possible, or to what extent that sort of, you know, to what degree we find salvation in music, for example, and you know, to what extent we can sort of make of our lives something that sort of is good for living and, you know, good for the now of life.
The beginning of the 60s was a time where in Paris and London the music scene rapidly evolved as well, following the first big fluxes of immigration from the ex-colonies. Now, the National Museum of Immigration in Paris is exploring the music movements of the 2 capital cities in the 60s and 70s. Let's find out more in this report.
The Twist, The Who, Millie Small. It's London and it's the 60s. 1962, in fact, the year Jamaica became independent, as did Algeria. Meanwhile, in Paris, things were hotting up in so-called Oriental cabarets with exotic music and belly dancers. And what better than a video jukebox to listen to some of the legends of Algerian singing and songwriting, like Noura and Kamel Hamadi.
The whole idea is that art, and particularly music, can construct collective identities, especially the identities of groups of immigrants living somewhere like England or France.
At the end of the 60s, in both capitals, music became more political. A famous example being Notting Hill Carnival, where people from the Caribbean spoke out against injustice. On the walls of the exhibit, and in Flesh and Blood, British DJ Don Letts, who worked with Bob Marley.
There's a picture of me and Bob Marley.
For him, it's a warning against populist movements.
Listen, in the 21st century, the world is in crisis. Donald Trump has started a disease that's spreading all around the world. And I think this exhibition is a timely reminder that culture is not something to be scared of. It's something to embrace. And that's what will make the world great again.
In the 80s, the March for Equality and Against Racism was the first countrywide protest of its kind in France. It led to the creation of the charity SOS Racisme, whose concerts attracted some of the biggest names like Manu Dibango and Khaled, immigrants who helped redefine French music.
It really does look like a very interesting exhibition, Owen.
It does, yeah. I'll be going as soon as I can, I think. It's very interesting. It made me think of, I've been listening a lot recently to a compilation called London is the Place for Me, which is a 6-volume compilation of lots of calypso by people who came over, lots of them who came over with the Windrush generation. And it's such a fantastic collection, and seems to me to be sort of absolutely crucial in terms of understanding the UK today. So I'd heartily recommend that to anybody watching who's interested in understanding a little bit about where we are today.
Okay, and just before we go as well, you've got another recommendation for us, your cultural pick of the moment. What is it?
Well, yeah, it's I chose the film Shoplifters, I think is the English title, by the Japanese director Hirokazu Koreeda, which is just a beautiful film. I mean, I've struggled a little bit recently with sort of, art for enjoyment, if that's sort of not too silly a thing to say. Just because, we live in a strange world and art needs to do other things as well. But I think what this director does is sort of remind us that tenderness is still a virtue and a going concern in this world. And he doesn't either sort of shy away from sort of more difficult social questions, because he has he creates a kind of ideal, a familial ideal, which exists outside of the law as the law is constructed. So it's a fantastic film.
Shoplifters, Owen Martell, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Today, and we're going to leave you with Shoplifters, and Owen's book Intermission has just been translated into French. Remember our website. We're also on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. There's more news coming up on France 24 after this.
それ食べさせたら返してきなよ。
今日外寒いんだよな。
華奢だね。
ねえ、誘拐だよあれ。どう見ても。
めっちゃ可愛いじゃん。選ばれたのかな、私たち。
ユリが映ってる。
児童相談所が警察署に連絡したことで。
ああ、まずいな。これまずいよな。